Good evening. I'm Nell Painter, Madam Chairman of MacDowell, one of the country's oldest artist residencies. The MacDowell campus is located in Peterborough, New Hampshire, where each year over 300 individual artists are given rare space and time in which to create new work, freedom to create. MacDowell is comprised of 32 separate studios and the James Baldwin Library. It's on over 400 bucolic acres, and the program provides fellowships across 7 artistic disciplines, including film, theater, literature, music, architecture, and visual art. For over a century, the work created at MacDowell has moved into the world: novels, poetry, journalism, plays, concerts, movies, and it continues to entertain us and influence our culture. Today, we focus on the literary arts, following up on the earlier enactment of identity with Jacqueline Woodson, Andrea Martin, and Indu Rubasingham. Today, we focus on the literary arts and have with us P. Carl, Chang-rae Lee, and MacDowell's own Michael Chabon. P. Carl joined Arts Emerson as director of How I Round in 2012 and was named co-artistic director in 2015. Prior to How I Round, he served as artistic director of the Playwright Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and as director of artistic development at Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago, Illinois. With Arts Emerson, Carl has been the dramaturge of Claudia Rankine's The White Card, Melinda Lopez's Mala, Jessica Blank, and Eric Jensen's How to Be a Rock Critic, excuse me, and Deborah Stein and Sully Hullam's The Wholehearted. In 2015, the National Theater Conference named him Theater Person of the Year for 2015. And the University of Minnesota named him Alumnus of Notable Distinction. He is currently a Distinguished Artist in Residence on the faculty of Emerson College. Chang-rae Lee is the author of 6 novels: Native Speaker of 1995, A Gesture Life, 1999, Aloft, 2004, The Surrender, 2014, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, On Such a Full Sea, 2014, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle and won the Heartland Fiction Prize. The Surrendered, I think, was 2010. You'll have to correct me, Chang. And My Year Abroad, this year, 2021. His novels have won numerous awards and citations, including the Hemingway Foundation PEN Award, the American Book Award, the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, ALA Notable Book of the Year Award, the Ansfield Wolf Literary Award, the Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Award, and the NAIBA Award for Fiction. He has also written stories and articles for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Time Asia, Granta, Condé Nast Traveler, Food and Wine, and many other publications. MacDowell's own Michael Chabon is a novelist, essayist, and screenwriter whose works include the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier Clay, Telegraph Avenue, and the Hugo and Nebula Award-winning The Yiddish Policemen's Union, all of them written in part at MacDowell. He is a member of the Academy of Arts and Letters and served as chairman of the board of directors of MacDowell from December 2010 until January 2020, when I took the gavel. He worked on his latest novel, Moonglow, 2017, during a 2015 MacDowell residency. A memoir, Pop's Fatherhood in Pieces, was published in 2018. The issues that I wanted us to start with come from the discussion, the conversation with the 3 women artists, the previous one. And when we talked about the relationship between artist identities, however they define them, and their art. So I have several questions that overlap for our panelists today. Are male artists conscious of their identities, however they define them? as they make their art? Are male artists as conscious of their social identities as women artists as they make their art? How do male artists think about their identities? Do male artists even think about their identities? Hair is a pivotal matter for women artists in their lives and sometimes in their art. Does your hair matter to you as a person? Does your hair matter to you as an artist as you make your art? Are different expressions of hair, your own, your characters, differently marketable for your editors, producers, and audiences? Does it make sense for you to speak of male artists as an identifiable group? To get us started, I'd like each of you to say something about the father figures in your work. And I want to start with Carl, your own father, as he appears in your memoir, Becoming a Man, The Story of a Transition, 2020. Carl?
Yeah, well, my father figures quite prominently in my memoir and in my story, I think the book is obviously as much about gender transition as it is about becoming a white man at a very odd time odd is a euphemism for the time in our world, and so the thing one has to reckon with as you transition into a different identity entirely is, of course, all of the ways you come to know masculinity. And my father had an enormous impact. And part of the struggle was, what do you do when your father's not someone you like very much, but you love him? So I had to really reckon with that. And I find a lot of people in that place now as parents. They lose parents to like Fox News, but they still love their parents. And that sort of is what I was contending with in the memoir. And he's passed since the memoir came out, but I think I'll be thinking about it for the rest of my life. It's a very formative masculinity to have a very dominant father figure in your life.
Yeah, you mentioned just now about the marketplace. And the marketplace, I can't not think of it because the marketplace is how our art gets into the world. In an earlier version of maybe even before you started writing, you were thinking of your memoir as becoming a white man. What happened to the white in the title?
Yes, it was marketed out of the title. There's no comparison to transitioning as a white person to transitioning as a Black person and any person of color, and I felt like that was a crucial part of the book and had to be in the title, and had it up until the final minute. But the worry was that it would be read as some celebration of becoming a white man. Adopted by the white
Oh dear.
and the thought of that was sickening enough that I
was like, yes.
Yeah, I'm a white man, damn it. Yeah. So anyway, that's that. So it disappeared, but it's very much in the book. So
Yeah. So Chang, you're laughing at this. What's funny?
Well, particularly in my case, because some of my characters are, have this anxiety of, am I becoming a white man? And entering white society and assimilating into white society. Without really consciously doing so, but being so ingrained in it that you forget your own contours and features. But I was interested in what Carl said about not liking but loving a father, and for me it was a little bit different. My first novel came out about 4 years after my mother died, and I love my father absolutely, and I also kind of liked him, but I was, for the first time in my life, I think, frustrated with him for lots of reasons I won't go into.
Well, maybe one.
Well, just he had moved on in his life and remarried, and I was happy for him for that, but I felt like he was moving away from us kids, and just because of, the natural new relationship he had. I think this is what all kids go through.
Mhm.
But so in writing Native Speaker, I would never have said at the time that I was writing about my father, but I look at it now, and I, not now, but in recent years, and it's riddled with father figures. I mean, it's lousy with them. It's not just his, in the book, there's the father who's died. There's a politician whom the protagonist models himself after, and is enamored with in many ways, also fearing. But there are also, his boss at work, and then his wife's father. There are all these figures who are, in his orbit, I guess in his psychic orbit, where he's constantly looking at them, trying to see what kinds of reflections make sense, what he abhors. And the funny thing is that none of those folks are my father at all. My father's he's gone now, but he was a very soft-spoken, very kind, very open-minded, for a Korean immigrant of his generation, psychiatrist. So he was somebody who was, open to talking. And all these other figures, though, I think in a funny way, I was working through certain frustrations and even anger at my father through these other fellows. And of course, they had different kind of cultural relationships in the novel, and social relationships than I ever had with my father. But I think it was kind of like, putting costumes on my father, and having kind of an indirect conversation with him about fatherhood, about being a model son, about everything, about being a Korean in America,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and also, of course, about his relationships with women, which is a fairly big point of contention in the book. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we might very easily go from your identity to your art with those figures because they're Korean American. But what about Jerry Battle in A Loft,
Well,
who's Italian?
he's an Italian American fellow, on the cusp of 60, and he was somebody, I think, that, again, it was another point in my life where I recently had my children, so they were young at the time, and I think I was just having a lot of anxiety about the father I was, and
Mhm.
particularly the father, and worried about the father that I could be. I think I was very busy at the time, just really wrapped up in my work and my teaching, and starting to feel as if I was detached from my family, even at the very moment when you think that you would be absolutely attached,
Yeah.
with young children. And I'd seen a couple fellows of a certain age, with grown children, empty nesters, who'd basically set up a life for themselves where they were just kind of literally floating above it all, not really just seeing it, saying, talking about their connections, but having none. And so in a way, I was writing against my fears of who I might end up being as a father,
Yeah.
and I guess interrogating myself about what the kinds of things that I was doing, and that I was kind of emotionally laying the groundwork for a life that maybe I didn't want.
That you didn't want.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Michael, I just asked Chang about an Italian American figure in his art. You have an African American figure, Archie Stallings, in your novel Telegraph Avenue. Was there anything of your own identity in Archie Stallings?
Um, yes, I think so. Is in particular as Archie thinks of himself as a son to his father, and his relationship with his father you know, my parents divorced when I was about 12 years old, and my father, not long afterwards, moved away. I grew up in Maryland outside Baltimore, and he moved to Pittsburgh, which, you know, in those days was a long bus ride to go see him, and I didn't see him that often. And I definitely had a sense of, although I certainly didn't think of it this way at the time, and it actually took me many years and lots of therapy to, you know, to figure it out. But I definitely had a sense of having been abandoned by him. You know, not completely, obviously. He was there financially, always to support me and my brother, and we saw him at holidays and, you know, for a couple weeks in the summer. But to go from having this father, my father is a very strong presence for good and ill. He was very present in his person and in his voice and in his opinions, and to have that suddenly turn into almost total absence, you know, was a relative shock to me. And Archie's father abandoned him more completely than mine did, but still to have that sense of having been abandoned. And then, you know, I was interested to hear what Chang was saying about the multiple father figures, because, you know, I sort of thereafter became kind of a father collector going through life. You know, I have lots still to this day. I have many relationships with older men, although I have to say the older men are getting scarcer and older. But you know, I've always seemed to have sought out men to sort of serve in one way or another as father figures. I was very close to my father-in-law in my first marriage. I was close to my father-in-law in my second marriage. And Archie has some of that too. And he has, in particular, he has a relationship with this musician, Cochise Jones, who's like a kind of auxiliary father for him. And I think, you know, I think that's not uncommon for boys who grew up in one way or another without a father, even if it's just a emotionally absent father and not a physically absent one, to try to seek out other fathers, you know, a little bit like the Starship Enterprise seeking out new life and new civilizations.
Mm-hmm. Did you translate your father as you knew your father into art in Pops?
Well, maybe in the sense that I left a lot out. You know, I left a lot. I was not looking to do any kind of a hatchet job on my dad, or, you know, you know, there was so much I could have said, even in the way of adducing further evidence of the points that I was trying to make. If I was maybe to some degree or another leveling a particular charge against my dad in the gentlest way possible about his maybe not necessarily having been the most emotionally available person. Let's say, you know, I chose the softest, tenderest examples of that I could find. You know, I wasn't looking to embarrass him publicly or shame him publicly in any way. So to the extent that I really did leave a lot out, yeah, and could have adduced some, you know, much more kind of grievous examples than I did. I'm not sure if that qualifies as making art or not, but I mean, art is definitely about leaving things out. So.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Before I ask you other sort of clearer male identity questions, I want to ask each of you about your hair. Hair is one of the issues that is crucial for women artists, partly because our appearance is so much more judged, but it is not so much marketable as art. Would you write a book about yourself and your hair? Let's go back to Carl, because Carl has probably the, I don't know.
The least amount of hair on this panel.
Okay.
Hands down, I think. So
You have actually talked about your hair in public. Could you make art about your hair? Either would you want to make art about your hair, or could you sell your art about your hair?
Well, it's funny as that because there was a whole chapter in the memoir about fashion and hair, etc., that got deleted. So clearly, I'm not able to sell that in a marketing sort of way. I didn't. It wasn't as convincing. But I mean, as a trans guy, there's I like to say there's at least a 2-year stretch where the only thing you think about is your hair, facial hair, regular hair.
Oh, yeah.
It is like the great obsession. And so I know pretty much every inch of my hair. Yeah. So it's a big part of transitioning. And you want your hairline to recede, which is opposite of what most men are looking for. So yeah.
Because that's more masculine?
It's an identifier of masculinity, right? Is a receding line.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As you're transitioning and hoping, to live fully embodied as yourself, you want all of those identifiers that.
Yeah. When we went and talked about it, we only talked about head hair, obviously. Though if we were talking about age, we might have talked about the mustache you grow and things like that. But as you add in facial hair, I'm thinking the most splendid of the three of you in terms of facial hair is Michael. Now, Michael, you've been able to get rid of that because you're no longer in quarantine. So that's a decision you've made to keep your beard. Is this art?
I mean, I obviously being a white man, so many of the it's so much of being a white man is being able to take things for granted and not having to think about things like your hair, for example. And it's very much that way with me. Like I recognize objectively, I know people I have long hair and I have a big beard, and I know people see me that way and they might talk about me or identify me that way. But this, like, my hair has nothing to do with me, in the sense that if I lived alone, if I were not married to a woman, I would just have not even a crew cut. I would just have a buzz cut down to the most minimum level of hair, so that I would never have to look at it, think about it, talk about it. I could put a hat on and take a hat off and nothing would have changed underneath the hat. I have zero interest in my hair whatsoever. The only reason it's like it is because I live with someone who cares about my hair a lot and encourages me to do certain things with it according to her preferences, and criticizes it when it goes awry. And with the beard, it's much more a case of neglect. I think quarantine introduced me to the remarkable possibility that I could just ignore my beard too, and occasionally just trim it when it starts to get annoying. And so, yeah, for me, my hair is of zero interest whatsoever.
I don't believe that. But let's take this to Chang, who has very
true. I don't look at myself in the mirror. If I look at myself in the mirror, it's because I have like a bump on my face that hurts. See what it is.
Well, it's a funny question because I never have been asked about hair, although I must admit one of the first this was a long time ago, after maybe my second novel, and someone said, I can't remember if it was in an article or it must have been before social media, where someone said, well, among literary people, Chang has some great hair. And of course, I'm sure they had to include Michael, because Michael, he always had that long hair, and I think we're always very, conscious of that. So again, that was a surprise to me that people would talk about it. And in terms of like my self-view, I think I'm more with Michael. It just, it happens this way. But more and more, maybe because I'm getting more and more gray, people, like yesterday when I checked in to this hotel, the guy said, "You've got great hair." I don't know where that came from, but and I think
silver.
Yeah. But because I knew that you had you were going to ask a question about this. I was thinking back to the work, I wondered if I'd ever described male hair. And I don't think I have until this last book, where I do actually make a point of describing. There's the narrator, and then the main counterpart is a Chinese businessman who has a
Yeah.
very weird head of hair. It's maybe a toupee, maybe a weave, and it's kind of a shell of a thing. And so I do know that I guess I'm conscious of other people's hair, and probably more in some ways, obviously female hair than male hair. But when male hair to me, is distinctive, I absolutely always notice it. And I don't know why, but but it's not something that I think it doesn't enter, at least consciously, any part of my work or merely most of my day. So, and also as an Asian male, I mean, the only thing that I'm conscious of is not having a lot of body hair. you know
Well,
which
that's hair.
yeah,
That's hair.
because I couldn't, although I looked a lot different, in certain parts of the pandemic with my facial hair. I could never get like Michael. It just doesn't get that way. I get that long kind of thing, and which I should try to rock. But
I would like to see that. Yeah.
But maybe it goes to, and maybe as an Asian male, it goes to ideas about masculinity, and especially with body hair. Luckily, my wife doesn't like body hair on her men. At least that's what she says. But I'm always aware, of course, that wow, growing up, especially when you're a teenager in the locker room, you're like, wow, it's like he's wearing a rug on his
Oh,
back.
yeah.
And I know that, looking at my dad, that'll never happen for me. And of course that brings up all these ideas about Asian masculinity versus Caucasian or Black masculinity, and all those things that it's that aren't central to again my artistic or personal consciousness, but obviously that's just in the water, it's just in the air, right? And it's something that I'm sure is there in the background.
So you all have really broadened the question of hair from not just head hair, but to face hair and body hair. There's another kind of hair that you've touched on, which is gray hair, which is what counted so much for women because of the appearance of getting older. You all have included older men in your work, but it's not clear to me if you've included older men in your work as you identify as an older man yourself, or if you identify as the son figure, S-O-N figure. Carl, you transitioned at age 51.
Yeah, 50, yeah.
Okay, 51, which means that you left being menopausal or postmenopausal female body, and you turned into a young man. Are you going to become an old man?
Well, there are upsides and downsides of transitioning, and one of the upsides is eternal youth. But many trans men seem to look a little bit younger, and I don't really know exactly why that is, but it's not unusual. But I think for me, I really feel like I'm in the transition of becoming not the son finally. And I think that's in part because I feel embodied as a man. And for me, I always felt like being, sort of misseen as a woman made me always feel diminished and younger and invisible in a certain way. And it's hard to advance, I think, emotionally when you're in that position. And so when I was first starting to transition, I wrote a piece called A Boy in a Man's Theater, because I felt like I had just been stunted at boyhood because I was not a woman. I had never been a girl. And so I just sort of, I dressed like, I mean, I still kind of dress like a boy, but I dress like a boy. I now have, more suits and things, but, and I really identified with boys. I have had fun with young men and loved playing basketball with the neighbor, etc. And so I feel like what the transition has allowed me is a sense of that I'm a 54-year-old man, and I like that transition quite a bit. Actually, I think it was time to embody my age in that way.
You you make theater. You're a theater maker, and one of the theater people, I won't say you made, but certainly you fostered, was a person called Judy, whose sort of social name was Judy. Is that right? And when you were talking with Judy, you were talking about the importance of embodiment in theater. Is that different from the kind of embodiment that Chang and Michael do in their fiction? Or is this just a fiction in the theater of the same sort of thing?
I mean, I think it's different. And I think what's different about it, if you want to know the most contentious thing happening in the theater right now, it's what bodies actors can actually act as, right? And it's not that that's not controversial in terms of writing about different bodies, but to actually say I'm going to perform a part as a cisgendered person, I'm going to perform a trans person. Anybody who's following the news has seen the outcry every time that occurs. And so I think the actual idea of going inside of somebody else's body is really a different phenomenon, and it's thrown the theater community. I teach in a performing arts department, and honestly, trying to figure out who plays what is it's almost impossible, in that if you create a trans part and you have a trans student, are you pigeonholing that student to play the trans part? If you have no trans parts, what are you saying to that trans student? I mean, so you're constantly negotiating something that's impossible to negotiate around bodies, right? And so I think this is, and it's very alive in the theater in that way, because everybody's in the room talking about it. And so I sort of love that argument. I love that we're fighting over it. I love that we're trying to figure it out. And I think we have a lot of conversations yet to be had. So. But I do think it's different than in fiction, and it's different and then in, like, even for me, as somebody who writes a memoir and creative nonfiction, in some ways it's all very fictional, right? I meet a guy. A lot of my book is about meeting guys. I have a 10-minute conversation with them, and then I tell you who they are, right? And am I 10% right? Am I 90% right? I'm making up who I think they are, right? And so that is part of I think paying attention, and I'm obsessed with how men behave and misbehave, and so you're always kind of making up the rest of their lives for them, but that I think is different than saying I am them on the stage.
Right. So you've lived and described, Carl, your two social biological identities as a trans person, but I wonder to what extent Michael and Chang also inhabit multiple male identities, multiple human identities. And one thing that struck me as I was reading about Chang and Michael's work is they spoke not so much about identity, but about experience. Michael, Chang, is experience your word for identity? Is identity nothing for you outside of your experience, Michael?
Well, it's funny. I was looking at the questions as you had provided them ahead of time and starting to think about them and realizing that I feel strangely almost illiterate on the subject of identity when it comes to myself and my work. And that immediately started me wondering, my immediate assumption at this stage in my life and in the history of our country and what the discussions we're having, like Carl was just talking about, it was like to immediately ascribe that illiteracy to privilege in some way, that maybe there's so much that I take for granted about who I am, about what that means, about what I have access to and what I don't have access to, where I can go and where I can't go, and things like that. When it might be that, or it might be that, when I'm writing, when I'm trying to create a fictional world,
Yes.
that bears some relation to this world that we live in,
Yes.
that will be recognizable to readers as some kind of corollary or analog to the world that the reader lives in. I do that through a point of view, and that point of view might be a narrator's point of view. It might be an omniscient narrator, where the question of identity, it's present, but it's typically in a traditional narrative kept sort of, it's not really what that book's about. A book that's about the identity of its omniscient third-person narrator is a very different kind of book than the types of novels that I tend to write. Or I'm deep in the point of view of one particular character, or maybe a range of characters, but it's deep inside the consciousness of an individual human being whom I'm inventing to some degree, or it's a first-person narrator who's telling their own story. So, I'm so focused on the need to persuasively counterfeit the presence of an authentic sounding, authentic seeming, but entirely fictional human being, that questions of my own identity, although I'm sure that identity, however it might be constructed, is always playing into the words I'm choosing and the way I'm looking at the context that I'm creating and all of those things. I'm totally not conscious of any of that stuff. What I'm conscious of is, what's happening here. How do I convey what's happening to a reader in a way that the reader can hear it, see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, and do all that at the same time while creating some kind of persuasive, fake human being on the page who will feel real to the readers reading them. And so it's not that identity isn't important to that process, but it often feels like it's someone else's identity that I'm dealing with, whether it's someone who's maybe biographically similar to me or comes from the same kind of context that I come from, or it's someone who's very different from me. And it feels like such an all-consuming but tiny task. Like the hole that I'm looking through to create the world that I'm trying to create is so narrow because it's just one human consciousness, albeit a fictional one. There's a lot that I'm not aware of while I'm trying to be so hyper aware of what lies immediately before me on the page as my task.
So as an artist, you don't have an identity.
While I'm writing, like while I am sitting in my chair typing on the keyboard, yes, I think that feels sort of accurate. Like I don't actually exist in that moment. I'm just dictating or the words are coming from somewhere, some part of my brain, obviously. I don't ascribe it to any kind of external divine inspiration or anything like that, but I'm so listening so hard and so carefully to try to catch that cadence that I'm not aware of anything else. Ideally, it does not always like that. A lot of times I can't get that level of focus or concentration or whatever it is, a flow state, but at its best, I sort of zero out.
You're not there. Yeah. What about you, Chang? Does that work for you as well?
You know, I think it's a bit different for me. I I think I know exactly what Michael's talking about, you know, about that exertion, that pressurized state of focus that I think does naturally erase most of you. But at the same time, and I guess this is just where experience for me is identity, is that I, growing up the way I did in a non-English based family as an immigrant, I was always very conscious of my place in any given context.
Mhm.
And from the youngest age, and I could see it not just in my, and even if I wasn't thinking about it in myself, I could see it at, say, my mother. You know, my mother came over this country when she was 27 years old,
Ah,
and she was so many different people depending on the context she found herself in. Just out of, and not because she's some kind of, she's trying to be winning, or you know, it's just and this is what I think a lot of people don't realize, is that certain people, say like my mother, who in Korea was actually quite a famous woman, very beautiful. She was actually in Time magazine when she was, you know, in her 20s. Um, very articulate, powerful, in control. But in America, and from what I saw, you know, from the age of, you know, 3 as I was sentient, you know, someone who was very tentative, very cowed, over polite. Um, you know, so speaking about her identity is a very difficult thing, because she only lived ultimately and died in this country. And it was only at the end of her life where she found a measure of comfort and belonging, um, and a sense that, you know, that things were more aligned than before, that quote unquote her true identity came out. Um, but so I've, and to a lesser extent, I've I've felt this too. Um, so that person, and for example, when I say go to Hawaii, Honolulu, a very Asian American place, um, I must say I feel absolutely, you know, I feel different there. I think about different things, and I wouldn't be able to say that it doesn't affect my work. How
mhm,
could it not?
mhm.
Because the way I'm treated, looked at, you know, it's in many ways completely invisible in Honolulu, but in the right way, of it, you know, in a positive invisibility.
Yeah, I understand. That's
Yeah,
one of the reasons I live in Newark.
right,
Uh,
exactly, exactly, exactly. Um, the kinds of language, you know, that I'll use, and the kinds of assumptions I will and won't make, totally different than when I was living in the East Coast, and even in San Francisco, which is a very Asian inflected town. So,
Yeah.
um, and so I can't, I don't think I can, that there's that full erasure for me working, because it's just, it's never been there,
Mhm,
because it's not that there's always a question, and there's always a friction,
mhm.
and sometimes often I think a good friction, and one I depend on, and have come to depend on and learn from as an artist.
It,
Uh,
Go
that
ahead, Michael.
well,
yeah.
I think it's interesting that this notion of invisibility has come up twice now from Carl and from Chang in two totally, as one in a negative context, and one, you know, the value of being seen and the pain of not being seen. And then on the other hand, this this kind of benevolent invisibility, or I don't know what, benign invisibility, I don't know what you would call it,
Yeah.
where it's a mark of belonging in a sense, as opposed to the invisibility that comes when you don't belong or when you don't fit. There's something fascinating in that idea that the same word could be used to describe
Yeah.
different.
Well, certainly in my experience, I have felt at the same time both invisible and hypervisible at exactly the same time. But I want to ask Chang about, to go back to the marketplace. You have 6 books, starting with Native Speaker in the 90s. Do you think if you had written those books in Hawaii, you would have found the market you found?
No, I don't think so. I think in Hawaii, their sense of race and difference and diversity is absolutely different than ours. It's not actually it's something that which is what I know is that, say, young people who come from Hawaii to the mainland for college are who are, say, Asian, at least, phenotypically. I think they're amazed by the kinds of discussions and concerns that Asian American students have on the mainland.
Sure.
So in a way, no, and this is the funny thing about belonging, and this is about that benevolent belonging, as Michael called it, is it's led me actually to critique belonging, because when you're too comfortable and too invisible, you start taking things for granted again.
Yeah,
And the same, and maybe start to recreate some of the maybe even bigotry or partisanship in certain ways that of the communities that were giving you that friction to begin with.
Sure.
So it's helped me, and I've come full circle about it.
Mhm.
And so I distrust sometimes how wonderful I feel in a way. and wonders what is the nature of self and society, and what is like the ideal place. It's certainly not ours, and it's maybe not even theirs.
Yeah. Well, maybe for someone who is making art, it's that in-between place, or going back and forth, because being in a body as someone who lives a life and being a body as someone who makes art, those are not the same bodies. But Carl, you wanted to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to try to interrupt. I would just the friction thing that you're talking about, Chang, I think is so key in terms of where we are as a culture and trying to navigate that as individuals as well. For me, I feel like it's the friction where all of my creativity comes from, because I literally live I call them parallel lives that have nothing to do with each other. One is being like this trans mentor, trans person for all of the students, and all of this person who's representing something, and people are gravitating to me as a safe space. All of the I have all the queer students in my classes and all the trans students, and then there's this other me who just walks around as a white guy and has all different kinds of conversations, and is not seen as queer. I'm kind of a guy's guy in those spaces. I like bourbon and sitting at the bar, and I like doing handiwork with hanging out with the contractors, that kind of stuff. And so they're hardly connected at all. And what I find so fascinating about that is that they can't be connected, right? Because I'm teaching a course right now in white masculinity, right? And so I start the course with, just give me a 1-page response to white masculinity. You hear those 2 words together, what do you write? And 18 students, toxic is in all 18 responses, right? So the culture we're currently living in, you say white masculinity, and toxic comes right along with it, right? And so part of the disconnect for me is both understanding that, being treated that way. When I was on fellowship at Princeton and getting death threats for being a trans person. Why would a trans person be in an Ivy League teaching a class and on a fellowship, And so you feel the horror of toxic white masculinity. At the same time, I feel the utter pleasure of my masculinity, and I feel the utter pleasure of being a trans man, and all those things I feel can be true at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself thinking when Chang was talking, and Carl, when you're talking about how it is for me to be when I go to Israel, and particularly to Tel Aviv, and Israel is there's so much that I have to find a way to acknowledge and to point at when I'm in Israel, but at the same time, it's that cliche thing that Jews have been feeling since 1948 when they go to Israel, where you have that sense, and it's almost like I don't want to have it. I've resisted it all my life. Like when you're in Tel Aviv and you're hanging out with interesting people doing interesting things, leading interesting lives, and it's a great city just objectively, and I feel so incredibly at home and comfortable there, and at the same time I have to acknowledge at every single moment that just a mere miles away, this incredible atrocities being perpetrated constantly every moment. And I mean, talk about living on two tracks at once. And I think that there's Chang, when you were talking about that, what happens when you get too comfortable in your belongingness? Exactly. I mean, that's exactly the state of things over there, where you even went a step farther. It was like you were talking about Israel, even though I know you weren't, when you were saying, that you start to reproduce the very conditions under which you yourself suffered from, intolerance and persecution and all of those things. I mean, have we ever found the balance anywhere as a species in any kind of large community of us?
But we ask different things from artists.
Mm-hmm.
We don't ask artists to find the balance for society. We ask artists to make art that engages us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what MacDowell is all about, giving you the freedom to create. And since it is a heterogeneous place, it's not a Hawaii or an Israel or a Newark. And I think that's part of the beauty of the place, that you meet other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's in Telegraph Avenue and writing about Oakland and Berkeley and this whole East Bay area.
Yeah.
As far from as million light years away from anything like utopia as it might be, what I value about living here is the presence of so many people who are nothing.
Yeah.
Don't look like me, don't worship like me, don't talk like me, don't eat the food that we make in our kitchen. And that's the blessing of places like this.
We are coming close to the end, but I have some loaded terms that I want to ask the three of you about. What do terms often associated with male identity strike you as a person and as an artist? Terms such as masculinity and patriarchy. We've touched a little bit on masculinity, but what about patriarchy? Because that brings non-male people into the story.
I mean, I'll start there, which is because I think about this all the time when I'm teaching white masculinity, because white masculinity and patriarchy are hard to separate at times. And I think that the thing that's so interesting about the way patriarchy functions is that we are all embedded in it and we're all benefiting from it. So if we're sitting here and somebody bought our book, or we have an academic position in a college or university, or we are smack dab in the middle of patriarchy and reaping its benefits. If you have tenure, you are living out the dream of patriarchy, which is to have a lifelong job,
Oh no.
fire you.
Oh no! Chang and I are thinking
All right,
about
Chang.
Princeton and patriarchy.
The same as, you know, systemic racism. I mean, we have to own that, right? It is the marketing engine of this culture, or has been at least. I think we, you know, are hoping that that's going to change more than it has. But so I think my relationship to it, particularly having spent 50 years and identified in a different gender, I can tell you, I have a lot of really, really negative feelings about patriarchy. And when you've been victimized by it, for anybody who works in the arts, and if you work in the theater, I mean, patriarchy is alive and well. And when you've been victimized by it, you never forget that, you know. And so, you know, my mission is to both write and teach about the fact that we are always, it's always present. And the question is, how conscious and aware of it are we going to be? When are we going to act differently? When are we going to expose it? And when are we going to take our paycheck and cash it, you know?
That's a hard place to close your comment, Carl. That is, you get to the heart of the material in art. We do all have to take our paychecks and cash them. And as you were talking about patriarchy, both Chang and I, formerly of Princeton, you know, sort of felt the stab. For me, as a woman who spent many years in a very male institution, Princeton, even though it is co-ed, is still deep in its heart a male school, a rich male school, a rich male white school. But when I ask the question about patriarchy, I think I'm probably also asking a question about figures in art who are figures in your art who are not men, who are not masculine. Does your art reflect patriarchy in terms of the non-male figures? Maybe that's a way of asking it. Chang, I know that you, let's see, Brett Stevenson, I think, asked you about the mother figure in A Year Abroad, maybe sort of trending that way. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of, in a lot of my books, the women in the books are, if not victims, then just cast asides from a system of either Confucian patriarchy or you know, more establishment American mainstream patriarchy.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that I've dealt with a lot, is feeling the, you know, the, especially if you're conscious of it, the intoxicating power of patriarchy.
Mhm, mhm.
As I saw it in the ways that our families are set up, and the ways that, you know, there's a you know, woman and native speaker who is basically the stand-in wife and servant and maid for this family. She does all these roles, and of course, you know, she's meant to stay there. And it's very convenient for everybody. Of course, a tragedy for her. And I think I think in my work I've always mourned that,
Mhm.
and mourned as much for her as for the men in the books. They're if they're not explicitly doing so, I think they're reckoning their power,
Mhm.
you know, or at least just on the cusp of reckoning their power. Um, and it's, you know, for them, it's really unsettling.
It is. And for your readers?
I hope so. I
Uh,
hope so. Yeah, I hope
yeah.
so.
Michael, in a minute?
um, you know, I I think the masculinity side of things and the sort of traps and imprisonments and constraints and blank spots and blind spots of masculinity as it's typically constructed. It has been much more, something I've been more aware of, I guess, in creating fictional characters than the sort of underlying power structures that prop that idea of masculinity up. It's not, you know, I think the female characters in my novels, after a certain point, tend to be, they are fairly strong, sort of self-determining women for the most part, who definitely have met a lot of checks and setbacks in their efforts to be self-determining people who get to set their own agendas. But it's not a, I'm trying to think, you know, because of that, I don't think I have ever really presented a female character who's sort of just crushed or rolled over by patriarchy, or has been pushed aside by it completely, or you know, in the case of the grandmother in Moonglow, I'm trying to think about who's been damaged in a lot of ways, but I mean, except to the extent that you know, the Holocaust could be seen as an expression of patriarchy. Yeah. You know, I don't think there's a whole lot of it's not really germane.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you, Michael Chabon. Thank you, Chang-rae Lee. Thank you, P. Carl, for speaking so openly and honestly. You're such great artists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nell.